The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, an extended conversation with scholar and author Carol Anderson on the history of white rage against black advancement and its continuation in Trump's modern-day politics of grievance. Plus, Bill Press on the impact of Donald Trump's mental imbalance on the mental health of our nation. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Carol Anderson's 2016 book on white rage remains a classic text in our national conversation about race. In a broad sweep of history, she demonstrates how any significant advance toward racial justice in U.S. history has been met with powerful political backlash. And we say hello to Carol Anderson, Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Her most recent book, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, was a finalist for the Penn Galbraith Award for Nonfiction. She also is the author of a book you may remember, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, which was a National Book Critics Circle Award winner. Carol Anderson, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. And we're going to talk about how the concept of white rage helps us understand our current political landscape. But first of all, tell us what you mean by the phrase white rage.
And what I mean by that, so the best way for me to get into that is to tell you how I got there. And it started with Rudy Giuliani in 1999, with the killing of Amadou Diallo. And that's where the New York Police Department just rolled up on this black man standing on his porch. We fired 41 bullets at him. And Amadou Diallo hadn't done a doggone thing. And there was this interview with Giuliani and Ted Koppel, and all Giuliani kept talking about was how his policies were making the city safer, and how the city was safer because his policies were working. And I thought, the city wasn't safer for Amadou. Something's wrong here. And I couldn't quite, couldn't name it. And then I kept researching and writing. And we get to 2014 and Ferguson, Missouri is on fire. The killing of Michael Brown, the response of the Ferguson police, and the city is on fire. And it didn't matter what station I was watching, the pundits kept talking about all of this black rage. Look at this black rage. Look at black people burning up where they live. And I'm shaking my head. I said, that's not black rage. That's white rage. And I went, ooh, oh my, that's white rage. And I just started writing. And what I meant by that is that as a nation, we are so focused in on the flames that we miss the kindling. We miss the policies that create a space where there is no other means of expressing the destruction of a citizen's rights, because all of those institutions have undermined those rights. And so white rage are those policies. They emanate from the Supreme Court decisions, from the legislature, from the White House, from zoning boards and school boards. And what they're designed to do is, as African Americans advance toward their citizenship rights, those major advancements are met with a wave of policies that systematically undermine that advancement. And so we often, we often think of rage as this, and particularly white rage, as like the Klan.
Right.
We understand it with the Klan, we understand it with cross burnings, we understand it with tiki torches. I want us to understand it in a Brooks Brothers suit. I want us to understand it in a judge's robe, where it's quiet, methodical, corrosive, and absolutely destructive to American democracy.
Mm-hmm. One of the core beliefs of white rage is a belief in a zero-sum game. How does that concept fuel the feeling and expression of white rage?
And that zero-sum game basically says the only way that you can advance is at my expense, that there are only so many rights to be had. And so if you have rights, it's going to be at my expense. If I have rights, it's going to be at your expense. Now, when you set up access to rights as winner take all, then what that does is it creates a very destabilizing narrative, destabilizing situation, and a false binary. And so then the way that this deploys in the political realm is when you have like Andrew Johnson, who was the president coming out of the Civil War, and the Congress is trying to figure out how do we begin to acknowledge the citizenship rights of 4 million freed people. And they come up with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And he's like, our own people don't have rights like that. Why would we give them to them? So it's like, if our people don't have rights, they can't have rights. That framing, and that's a framing that we deal with even today. We deal with it in terms of schools, we deal with it in terms of housing, we deal with it in terms of employment, and we don't see how destructive it is because we require a whole mechanism to keep those people from having rights. And by doing all of that work, it undermines the ability of American society and American people and this nation to be as strong as it can possibly be. White rage is destructive.
Absolutely. Now, let's turn to elections. Your book, One Person, No Vote, tells of countless times white rage has contaminated what we like to think of as free and fair elections. Tell us, for example, Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, how in 1954 that was an expression of white rage, and why did it succeed?
So actually, Nixon's Southern strategy emerged in the 68 election. We started seeing pieces of it coming through early on with Eisenhower's election, where you got a group of southern states who were concerned that the Brown decision, the one that ended separate but equal, that the Brown decision was coming down the pike. And Eisenhower began to woo these Southern Democrats out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. By the time we get to 68 with Richard Nixon, it is full on because Lyndon Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here you have the Democrats saying that African Americans are actually American citizens. And we're going to put the power of the federal government behind enforcing their rights. You can no longer do the mess you have been doing all along. Well, the Southern Democrats were appalled. They were like, whatever do you mean? That Black people have rights that we have to recognize? Now, and remember that the Southern Democrats, their whole way of being was about the power of white supremacy, putting white supremacy into the legal fabric of the United States. And so now you have a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, going, no, we're not doing that anymore. Because remember, we're having the civil rights movement happen. So what Richard Nixon and the Republicans looked up and they went, oh my gosh. You mean right now there's a way that we can get all of those Southern Democrats and their representatives over into the Republican Party? And we can get those legislative reps there helping to push forward our conservative legislative agenda. This is sweet. and so they began the Southern strategy, and it dealt with really amplifying an anti-civil rights base for the Republican Party. And so you see it with Nixon talking about law and order, and defining lawlessness as something that is happening in the cities with Black folk. That becomes lawlessness. And you hear it later on. I mean, the master of it was Ronald Reagan, talking about these welfare queens who are dependent on government handouts and don't want to work. And so it begins to create these fissures, particularly as the US economy is contracting, to say, you know, you have worked hard for your job, but they're going to give it to some unqualified minority, zero-sum game. And you vote for me and I will ensure that you good, honest, hard-working white folk, you good, honest, hard-working Americans, get to keep everything that you've earned, and you don't have to give it to those unqualified people who are lazy and dependent. That's the messaging that you would hear over and over and over. And it began to move not only the South out of the Democratic Party, but it also was targeted at disaffected white ethnics, like the Italians, the Irish, who had been key pillars in the Democratic Party, saying, this is just the party of Black folk. There's no space for you here. They don't care about you and your rights. We do. And so playing to the politics of grievance, playing to the politics of resentment, and playing to the politics of racism. And it all worked.
Many have said that the election of Trump in 2016 was a continuation of Nixon's Southern strategy. Do you agree with that?
Oh my gosh, yes.
I actually think I knew the answer to that question before I asked it.
What was it? The language I was using, the politics of grievance, the resentment, these unqualified. I mean, and so the thing is that far too many Americans like to think of Trump as an aberration because it's just so raw and visceral and I think that's the scholarly term.
Yeah. You look it up in the dictionary and there's his picture.
I'm telling you. But in fact, he is the result of years of cultivating this base of racism, this base of the anti-government component is key in this too, because it's seen as when the government was committed to ensuring the rights of African Americans, then all of a sudden there was nothing the government could do right. So you get this anti-government basis in there as well. And so when you hear Trump you know, he, the best way I can do this is to talk about that incredible election in 2016. When you think about it, there were 16 other or so Republican candidates, many of whom had governing experience. They were governors, they were senators. Trump had none of that. And he wasn't a successful businessman. 6 bankruptcies or so. When you bankrupt a casino,
Right.
it just
I reference that one a lot.
yeah, because it takes a little special something to bankrupt a casino.
Right.
So, but what he did have, what brought him to the political fore, was birtherism. That's how he started making his political mark, to question the very legitimacy of Barack Obama. And he rode that racist horse all the way in. And remember, his first speech when he announced his candidacy was to call Mexicans rapists and criminals.
Right.
And build the wall, right? So his only attribute was racism. And he rode that into the White House. In that election that was marred by massive voter suppression, whites were the only racial group that voted in the majority for Donald Trump. Everybody else was like, oh no, was it by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes. Everybody else, but the message that he was delivering was a message of white rage. I will deliver the policies that will ensure that none of these minorities have access to the resources of the United States of America. I will ensure that my policies will put in place the judges who will ensure that minorities do not have access to rights. That's what Donald Trump brought. With white rage and by the use of voter suppression, which really just exploded with the election of Barack Obama, which I depict as the kind of penultimate response to Black advancement. You get a Black man in the White House, and it was like the system hit a major viral load about how do we stop this? How do we make sure that this doesn't happen again? And it was to go after what I call the Obama coalition. So one of the things we hear with the election of Obama is, well, how racist can America be? We put a Black man in the White House twice. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. So many. It's just like, we have crossed the racial Rubicon. We have overcome. Look at us. And what that actually is saying is that the majority of whites who voted cannot be racist because they voted for Barack Obama and put him in the White House. But that's not accurate. The majority of whites have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964. And that includes the sons of the South, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. They didn't receive the majority of white voters either. Neither did Barack Obama. He got a healthy share. Understand that. He got a really healthy share, not the majority. That healthy share wouldn't have been enough to get him into the White House. Instead, he had an incredible ground game of mobilizing and organizing and registering people who had never been part of the political process before to vote. Millions of new voters came to the polls. They were overwhelmingly African American, Asian American, Hispanic, young, and poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're speaking with Carol Anderson, author of One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, and White Rage, the Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. Coming up next, is America ready for a racial reckoning? But first we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
With our national election looming, someone should put up lost dog signs in every neighborhood saying, "Missing Republican Party platform." Voters won't find one, though, for this so-called major political party has decided not to produce a specific statement of what it stands for this year, nor will it offer to voters an itemized set of policies its public officials would try to enact if elected. Indeed, the GOP hierarchy is so disdainful of the electorate that it says the party will not present a platform until 2024. Yes, 4 years after the election. They've even imposed their policy silence on their own grassroots delegates, decreeing that any attempt by them to adopt new platform proposals at the National Republican Convention would be, quote, ruled out of order. Instead of a political party, the GOP of 2020 has become a pathetic puppet show of weakling officials and sycophantic subordinates being jerked around by the maniacal whims of a bloated ego with despotic fantasies. Thus, the once respectable Republican National Committee has meekly ceded its authority, duty, respect, and relevance to a single unhinged authoritarian. In essence, they're saying that the platform and the party itself is one word: Trump. Whatever poppycock the glorious leader utters today, whomever he attacks tomorrow, whichever fantastical conspiracy he embraces next week, the GOP will applaud, bow, and in unison reply, Amen. Sad. Republican senators, governors, captains of industry, elders, and others who once had power, prominence, some prestige, and maybe even a little pride, now meekly wear Trump's collar and kowtow to his conceits, leaving an entire party with the sole operating principle: what he said. This is Jim Hightower saying that's not a party, it's a national embarrassment.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you: the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're speaking with Carol Anderson, author of White Rage, the Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, and One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. And Carol, you wrote a piece for The Guardian in February titled, The Era of Whites-Only Elections in America Has Returned. What are some of the most egregious ways you see this happening?
So that piece And then I'm going to roll through it. That piece dealt with how the Democratic Party had set up its initial primary and caucuses in New Hampshire and Iowa, states that don't reflect the demographic diversity of the United States, nor of the party. And yet those two states were basically deciding who the Democratic nominee would be for president. It just was like, what? And it felt like a thing called the white primary that was in operation through basically the World War II. And it said that only whites could vote in the Democratic primary. Well, when you're in a one-party system like the South was, whoever won the Democratic primary was going to win the general election. And that's what this felt like. And it to me, it was indicative of this voter suppression push, where in 2016, Black voter turnout went down by 7%. Yeah, that's huge. The goal is to figure out, how do we back up and do this? In 1980, Paul Weyrich, who founded the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, he gave a speech where he said, I don't believe in good government. You want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Because in fact, candidly, our leverage goes up as the voting population goes down. And that frame of how do we entrench power in the hands of conservatives, that can only happen if we remove as many other voters from the electorate as possible. If we create policies like extreme partisan gerrymandering, where we can we privilege those who live in white suburbs and in white rural counties, and we dilute the power and the voices and the votes of African Americans and Hispanics and Asian Americans who are in the cities. And we get rid of competitive districts, which makes people think, oh, so-and-so is going to win anyway. There's no reason for me to vote. So you get a series of policies that are targeted at each of those groups in what I call the Obama coalition, to ensure that our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. Sobering, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-boggling, especially given that it's 2020. Is this an example once again of politicians, and in this case Republicans and our president himself, capitalizing on white rage?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Basically, they opened up the playbook and said, okay, we're going to run a 45-9-3-6-7-2, and just did it. And so you see that every time he looks like he's in political trouble, he does what I call throwing a pure uncut kilo of white supremacy on the table. Muslim ban, removing money from the military budget that was supposed to go for childcare facilities on the military bases, so his supporters could see that he's building the wall to keep out all of those Mexicans. It is, as he talks about how mail-in ballots in the middle of a pandemic, nothing but fraud, massive fraud, because generally mail-in ballots have been used overwhelmingly, like I talk about in Alabama, where Jeff Sessions went after the Marion Three, where whites had used the absentee ballots as a way to stay in power. And then when African Americans were like, oh, absentee ballots, okay, that's a way, because we're working and we can't get to the polls when they're open, we're going to use absentee ballots. And for that, they were hit with voter fraud charges and had to stand trial. They were found not guilty, but the tenor of that, the intimidation of that, having the state power just laying down on top of you, that's what Trump is doing. This fear of calling it fraud, but he used that in 2016 when he was in Pennsylvania. And he talked about, he was in some area and he said, I'm going to need my poll watchers to go up there to Philadelphia to make sure they don't steal this election. Again, the language of cities as crime-ridden, urban, Black, chaotic, theft. I mean, it's all, the imagery is there. And it's saying they're trying to steal this from you. Good, honest, hardworking, tax-paying Americans. Zero-sum game, laced with all of the racial tropes of chaos and theft and criminality.
Yeah. In the wake of massive protests sweeping the nation, there's been talk of a racial reckoning, and people are being told to read to better understand the moment. On almost every reading list we've seen, your books are there. Do you have a sense or a feeling that this time it's different? I mean, do you sense a new willingness to understand what you've been writing about?
Yes, I do. But I think what's happening in this nation is that we had a convergence of things. One, COVID-19. We're over 4 million who have contracted the disease. Over 150,000 have died. In just a matter of months. That's almost 3 Vietnam wars is what we're talking about here. And that was a 20-year war. And here we're talking about a death row. So the vulnerabilities of people, where their lives are being upended and their lives are being taken, leads to a sense of, oh my gosh, what's happening here? And I thought we could handle it. What's going on? I don't, that vulnerability. Then you take the mismanagement by the White House of the pandemic that led to an economic collapse. The figures came out, that the GDP contracted by 1/3. That is more than the Great Depression. And so this kind of economic vulnerability where people are standing in line for hours to get some food, where tens of millions have lost their health insurance because they're out of work. So that kind of economic vulnerability. So you're taking the vulnerabilities of their lives, of their health. You take then the vulnerabilities of the economic system. And then we see the images. We see the images of Ahmaud Arbery being hunted down in Georgia. We see Officer Chauvin with his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, casually with his hand in his pocket as the man is pleading, I can't breathe. And then he calls for his dead mother. Then we see the violent response by the police to peaceful protests. So you have the 75-year-old white man in Buffalo who is pushed down and his head cracks. The police push him down and his head cracks on the sidewalk. You see blood coming out of the man's ear. And the police just walk right on by as if there's not a human being laying there in trouble. All of that, I believe, has converged to ask, who are we? What kind of nation are we where our lives are so expendable? And where, we had heard police violence, police brutality, but we thought that was, well, what did Eric Garner do to, because he must have done something. What did John Crawford do? What did Tamir Rice do? What did, at a certain point, we've realized we can't keep asking that question because we thought that kind of police brutality was somehow cordoned off into just the Black community. But we see that culture of violence eddies out, it affects everyone. And so that's why I think this moment is different. Because we see democracy in peril coming out of the White House, COVID-19, the economy, and police violence. It's all converging.
And of course, the voter suppression, that obviously it goes along with all of this. And of course, as you well know, the loss of the ability to vote is unaccepted for each individual that it happens to. But what do we lose as a nation when we allow voter suppression to happen?
Oh, we lose our democracy. We lose the thing that we say we are. We lose having representatives who are truly representative. I'll give a couple of examples. So as a historian, I'm going to start historically. In 1940, because of the voter suppression, the disfranchisement techniques that the South had used, poll taxes, literacy tests, good character clauses, understanding clauses, is that you only had 3% of age-eligible adults, Black adults, registered to vote in the South in 1940, as the U.S. is getting ready to go fight Nazis. 3%. You had, in some elections, single-digit voter turnout rates in the South. 3%, 7%. These are the folks who are then sitting in Congress. And because of the seniority rules, because they only have to be responsive to 3 to 7% of their population that's voting, they are getting reelected and reelected and reelected. And then they're shaping the laws that deal with our labor rights, our voting rights, our civil rights. They're the ones who are sitting on the judiciary committees, appointing, handling the confirmation of justices. They're the ones, so you can see how this kind of hulling out of the electorate in one area affects the entire nation. We all lose. We're seeing that now. What extreme partisan gerrymandering has done, you think about it. The majority of Americans want health care. They want access to quality, affordable health care. With extreme partisan gerrymandering, despite the fact that you have the vast majority of Americans wanting this, you haven't seen any kind of reasonable plan coming through from the Republicans who are blocking that action. The same thing goes with, basic background checks for gun ownership, and making sure that we don't have military grade weaponry in the hands of civilians. After El Paso, Lord, We're at that anniversary right now. After Sandy Hook, after Pulse, after. This should be, you look at the majority of Americans are like, look, this is in the land of people. This isn't hard. Civilians should not have military grade weaponry. Why haven't we seen any movement on? This is the power of voter suppression in blocking the will of the people for the nation's good. That's what we lose with voter suppression.
It's very sobering, but we do have an opportunity to do something about it. Probably a better opportunity now than we've had ever. It's kind of disheartening at the same time to see where we are right now.
Absolutely. I think back to 2016 and how many of us were just jumping up and down and hollering. It felt like a horror movie where you see the house and the walls are bleeding and you're saying, don't go in the house. Don't go in the house. And sure enough, boom, we're in the middle of the bleeding house. But yes, this is why, and what we're seeing in the primaries, even in the midst of a pandemic, has been massive voter turnout, record voter turnout. And this is where, as sobering as this is where my faith is. My faith is in the people. They have been in the streets fighting for this democracy. They have been at the polling stations. Remember the images of banging on the doors in Kentucky. Let me in so I can vote. That's powerful. Here in Georgia, people standing in line in the midst of a pandemic for 5 hours to vote, determined to have a say in this democracy and to right the course, to get us out of the bleeding house.
We will end it there because that's a very positive note. It's one where we're clearly stepping into the right direction, and we can only hope that continues to snowball and we move forward, and November 3rd can't happen soon enough. Carol Anderson, Charles Howard Candler, Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, joining us today. Again, her most recent book, One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, and another good one for you to read, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. Carol, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back and do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press on Donald Trump's mental health and what that has to do with the mental health of millions of Americans.
Let me start out by saying, for the last 3 weeks, talking to some of your colleagues, we've been exploring issues with Donald Trump's own mental health. In this episode with you, we'd like to look at how Donald Trump's mental imbalance has impacted the mental health of all the rest of us. So let me ask you each, and Dr. Panning, start with you. In dealing with your patients, have you seen any sign of what we might call a Trump post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Yes, absolutely. I'm in clinical practice as a psychologist in Evanston, Illinois, which is a very progressive community just north of the city of Chicago. And so all of my clients are progressive like me. So there is certainly a bias there, but absolutely, I saw a lot of, stress and anxiety leading up to the election of 2016. But afterwards, it's been quite a volatile ride for many people who are tuned in and who are watching and noticing and concerned about the president's mental health and the impact of anxiety and chaos and stress that we've been all sort of witnessing in the past 3.5 years.
And you, in fact, have coined the phrase Trump anxiety disorder. How do you see that manifest itself?
Yeah, I see it in many ways. Anxiety disorder is characterized by symptoms that are both psychological in nature as well as physical. So psychological meaning ruminations, worries, constant thoughts of what might happen next, as well as physical symptoms such as physiologically feeling agitated, muscle tension, headaches, stomach aches, all sorts of different symptoms that can come back to anxiety. So in a traditional generalized anxiety disorder, it's a constellation of symptoms. And for somebody to be diagnosed with that, per the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that therapists use, they have to be experiencing many of these symptoms for 6 months. So that is generalized anxiety disorder. Trump anxiety disorder is not an official diagnosis. It is more of a phenomenon that we've noticed since Trump has been, well, I guess after the election and certainly after he's been in office, but more characterized in things like having a constant worry about the future, feeling very on edge and dread about what might happen next, more of being concerned with a lot of media impact in terms of scrolling on Facebook or Twitter, watching the news much more than normal, and being very consumed and concerned about what might happen next. I think what we're seeing, with Trump's history here as our president is a feeling of this is not right, this is not normal behavior, and what's going to happen next. So with COVID, I think there's certainly a whole nother layer that we've seen with concern around Trump anxiety, given the failures of his leadership, given the outright denial, the backtracking, not listening to scientists, wanting to go full steam ahead without consulting with experts. So I think there's a different layer now that COVID is here and how that's impacted many Americans. But I think for general progressive Americans are feeling scared. They're feeling fearful. They're feeling dread. They're not sure what's going to happen next. And it is having a serious impact on their general psychological health on a daily, day-to-day basis.
And Harper West, what has been your experience with your clients? Have you experienced the same?
Yes, very much the same. I'm not in quite as liberal an area, a little more of a purple area of a purple state in Michigan, but definitely throughout Donald Trump's presence on the national stage, I found a lot of people, sort of being re-traumatized by his voice and his demeanor. I work with a lot of victims of abusive and narcissistic relationships because that's my specialty. And for them, in Trump, they become anxious when they hear and see him and watch his behaviors because it reminds them of their perhaps abusive parent or abusive spouse that they've had experience with. And then, yes, I agree. Since the COVID pandemic and then since the George Floyd murder, we've seen, I think, a dramatic increase in the number of people just sort of voluntarily mentioning that they just feel more anxious and on edge. And as Jennifer said, kind of this dread, this sense of doom that they experience is more prevalent.
And do they relate it to their own personal lives, their own personal experience?
I think they do. I mean, certainly with COVID, people have, specific losses that they can attribute to. I have had patients, had people die or lost their job or had a wedding they can't, attend or something. But many people, they see, for instance, the sense that, Black lives are being destroyed or harmed, and that is a personal issue for them. They feel very betrayed by their leaders in this country not working in their best interest. And so I think people do relate to it very personally. Mm-hmm.
Harper, I just had a session this morning with a client, a mother of two, and she told me, she said, I feel like I'm in a nightmare in terms of this presidency. And she's been talking, obviously more, and many of my clients have been talking more about the upcoming election and just the stress. And I think there is some traumatic reaction from 2016 when, everybody thought it was sort of a done deal that Hillary Clinton would be the president, and how everything changed on that election night. But I think people are really struggling and really fearful about what it might mean to have him become reelected.
And to what extent does uncertainty factor in all of this? Isn't that something that people kind of count on from their government or from society in general?
I think so. I believe people want a predictable, solid, dependable leader who they can predict what's going to happen. And of course, with Trump, boy, you don't know what his opinion is from day to day, tweet to tweet, right? I mean, he changes his mind, whether it's intentionally or impulsively or with a lie. It's hard to say. So I think that there is a great deal of distress of just not knowing what the country, where the country's headed in terms of policy or any other way. And it is distressing.
Well, I read in The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, now, when it was first published in 2017, that one half of the country felt stress and anxiety about Donald Trump's presence in the White House, which leads me to wonder, what's wrong with the other half? I don't know whether it's a higher percentage now, but for some people, is it just like a cult worship of a strong leader that they're comfortable with? Or have you thought about that?
I think there's definitely some brainwashing involved in this whole process. I mean, Trump does have the characteristics of a charismatic leader, and uses psychological strategies like, lock her up and different, very basic chants that appeal at fear and emotion. I do think there's also people who have, still support him for a variety of reasons, like religious people who are, very concerned about abortion as a right? And they, support the Republican Party and whatever candidate that comes along with it. And I do know there's people that, business owners and things, people that are concerned about their own small world, that they're still supporting of Donald Trump. But I think it is perplexing, when people see just the confusion and the chaos and the absolute destruction that he's, enabled in our country, that the people still do support him.
Yeah, Harper, does that concern you? I mean, that what for some people is a source of much stress and anxiety, for others is sort of a comfort, maybe.
It is a difficult, thing to understand. Certainly, again, with my population, they're very traumatized by Trump. But I think we can look at this too from a sense of, some people are very morally outraged by his behaviors and other people aren't. And certainly this can be part of an understanding that people do have different morals. But some people also just don't really have a sense of what we call pro-social behaviors and pro-social attributes. And so they're really not, those people are really morally outraged by Trump because they have more of a sense of caring about their fellow human beings. People on the antisocial end of the spectrum don't really care about their fellow human beings so much. So they are not as morally outraged by Trump because they align with him in that way. And they actually believe that we shouldn't care about our fellow human beings in the way that the pro-social people do. And that's a broad issue that I think falls into play here.
Jennifer, what happened to the belief that we're all in this together?
Ooh, yes. I mean, I think that's a very scary time right now that we're living in, that we're more divided than I think ever. I was talking to my mom the other day, who used to be Republican until Obama was elected and switched parties. And, I said, Mom, what was it like going through the Cold War ages and all the stressors in the past, and she said, it just feels different now. It feels much more scary and divisive and divided than ever before. I think one thing to add on what Harper talked about is the media. I think, if you listen to Fox News, you think like we're in this horrible state of Marxism and socialism taking over this country, and there's so much fear and there's so much. It feels like a different universe that they're talking about. Whereas if you listen to other news sources, so I think there's something that's been also stoked with that, is that people, if they have family and friends that are all conservative, then they're all listening to Fox News and they're worried. There's a defensive, reactive part to that of not being proactive and where are we going next? But oh my gosh, they're going to take away your guns and take away your rights, and the socialists are taking over the country and things like that. So that all, I think, contributes to this this disconnect in our country.
Both of you speak about the role of the media, and I'm going to get back to that in just a couple of minutes. But before we do, Harper, you mentioned anger in a blog that you recently posted. You talked about, I believe it was there, at any rate, you talked about one of the best responses, one of the best ways to respond to Trump is indignation, right? You want to elaborate on that a little bit? What do you mean?
Sure. Yes, I've written about this in journal articles and other places. I love this word indignation, and I often work with victims of abusive and narcissistic relationships to try and get them to be more indignant. It's a pro-social attribute that is self-protective. When we are morally outraged, when we have a sense of injustice, we should become indignant. And this can be a really positive thing. And it's more pro-social because it's about setting boundaries and caring for ourselves with healthy boundaries. And I think a lot of people that I see experience a sense of indignation when they look at Trump. They get morally outraged, especially if they've experienced any kind of childhood abuse or neglect. And that was a feeling they had as a child, that they couldn't express their outrage or indignation at a parent or abuser. But now they see this man in the White House who's behaving in very abusive ways, who's betraying the country, he's betraying the Constitution, he's violating social norms, and they become indignant. And this is what I see in a lot of people. And it can feel like anger, but I think it's a healthy form of anger. It can promote activism and a sense of self-efficacy, of being able to care for ourselves because we can protect ourselves.
So in other words, it's good to get pissed off, right? And then to do something about it. Jennifer?
Correct.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a huge part of this, right? Use the anger to propel and get involved and, get activated and not, see that we have hope in terms of people being able to speak out and, talk to people in swing states and write postcards or text banking or phone banking or all the different things we can do to help get out the word to vote. But if we just sit with that anger is going to destroy us. And I know Harper has written prolifically around this as well, but just the feeling that we're trapped in this abusive relationship with our president, right? And someone like a child, we can't escape, because hopefully we will have an escape in November. But until then, even though he's been impeached, even though there have been so many things that we thought, the Mueller report, other instances where we thought there would be some hope to have him out or have things change dramatically, that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So that anger needs to be either channeled into something pro-social and productive, and or, being able to take care of ourselves, exercise, make sure we're getting enough sleep. Maybe we have an outlet of some sort that we're able to channel that energy so it doesn't destroy ourselves in the process.
Jennifer, you used the phrase that Harper West has added to this discussion, which is, I think, Harper, you quoted one of your clients as saying, "I feel like I'm in an abusive relationship with the President of the United States." And you point out there are many parallels between Trump's behavior and an abusive spouse's behavior, correct?
Correct. Well, there are a number of behaviors that abusers engage in, and we can think of this again using even just the term antisocial as a spectrum. And one of the behaviors that antisocial types of personalities do is they violate the rights of others. And that's sort of a form of abuse, of course, right? It can take a lot of different flavors. This could be just mild lying and cheating, or it can be, very predatory and violent. But that sense that somebody is violating our boundaries, taking advantage of us, violating our rights, that's kind of what abusive behavior involves. And it can, again, take lots of different forms. And many people in Trump, they get triggered because he just reminds them of abusive people that they've had in their life. And that was my experience when I first ran into Trump. I really didn't pay a lot of attention to him. I didn't watch any of his TV shows, or, I'm not a big celebrity watcher. And when I first started seeing him come out on the campaign trail, I had this sort of visceral reaction to him. It was just repulsive. I was just disgusted because he reminded me of abusive people and narcissistic people that I've either been in relationships with or that I've treated. And it's deeply disturbing to those of us who can spot that type of personality.
I was going to say, usually we work with the victims. We don't work with the narcissists and the folks who are antisocial. Typically, we will work with their loved ones, their significant others, their children, their business partners, their coworkers, because they are distressed and confused, and these folks are using tactics like gaslighting, which is a tactic for people to start doubting what they see in front of their very faces in terms of very fact-based information. That an abusive tactic is to start questioning them. Oh no, that's not happening, and not only is that not happening, you're crazy for thinking so.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's why you call Trump the gaslighter in chief.
Many people have used that phrase.
I saw, again, in one of your chapters there in the book, that this, and you call them other blamers, the abuser, not the victim, right? Other blamers. That some of the behavior traits, and I just wrote them all down, include vindictive anger, lack of insight and accountability, dishonesty, impulsivity, entitlement, paranoia, lack of remorse and empathy, self-importance, and attention-seeking. I mean, bingo, right? That's Donald Trump.
Right. Check. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote that, 3.5 years ago or whatever, and it's all come true. We've seen all of those behaviors play out on a daily basis. And yeah, that's the kind of the core of the narcissistic personality or antisocial personality, or what I call an other blamer, is that lack of accountability that leads to all of those very unhealthy antisocial behaviors.
And Jennifer, which gets back to the question, and you said you treat, mostly you're dealing with the victims, right? Not the abuser. How does the victim respond to that kind of behavior?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is disconnecting from it, learning how to set up healthy boundaries, learning how to identify a situation that can turn volatile before it becomes very volatile. So that might be as simple as saying, okay, sorry, this conversation's over. With a conversation, or it might be physically leaving the location if it's starting to escalate and not feel safe. I mean, a lot of the literature with working with narcissistic or antisocial folks is not great in terms of prognosis, right? And they're often, as I mentioned earlier, not the ones that are seeking therapy. The loved ones of these folks are. And so the loved ones, it's often like cutting off contact, divorcing a significant a spouse, or cutting off contact, estranging from a family member, or figuring out what kind of framework they can have a healthy-ish relationship, meaning, they may need to have very strict boundaries, in terms of contact, how many times they see a family member, for instance, topics they can talk about. It might have to be very surface level because anything else can set that person off. And that is unhealthy for everybody.
So, Harper, how do we extend that to Donald Trump and the American people breaking off contact?
Well, certainly some of us believe that voting him out of office would be a great start. Because, ultimately, with that kind of personality, they don't change. As Jennifer said, they don't come into therapy and they don't ever change. So we have to manage the relationship. And cutting it off, no contact is generally the preferred method. Some of us might have preferred impeachment and conviction also as a method to get rid of Trump, or even the 25th Amendment to get rid of Trump, because he, I believe, is unfit for office. But we're left now with waiting for November 3rd.
But also breaking off in terms of a spousal relationship and in the political relationship, sometimes easier said than done, correct? I mean, do we really believe that that the abuser just accepts the break, or that Donald Trump will just accept the break?
Right. I've done some reading, and some people believe that he won't go quietly. He will, cause a lot of trouble between the election day and the inauguration day. And even after that, there are many people who suspect that he will continue to speak out on Twitter. He will incite his followers. He may buy a TV station and speak out on that TV station. So there is some concern that he won't go away. We will have to learn how to manage our reactions to that and not engage with him, but that may not happen for everybody.
So if we see this behavior on the part of Donald Trump and these character traits, a lot of people question Donald Trump's upbringing, his childhood, and what could have contributed to this. Now we have Mary Trump's book recently out, talking about her uncle Donnie. What do we learn from his childhood as a contributor to the behavior and the mental imbalance we see today? Jennifer, you want to tackle that first?
I just finished Dr. Mary Trump's book, which I thought was excellent and incredible. I think it's no surprise in terms of, it's actually very sad. And if he wasn't in the most powerful position in the world, and just a businessman in New York as he was before, I would have empathy for him given what he experienced. At age 2, his mother was significantly ill. They thought she was going to pass away. She survived, but she had, that started off a pattern of being chronically ill and unavailable for the children. So they were raised by an older sibling and given, taken care of in terms of food and some basic needs by a housekeeper, but they, in terms of warmth and connection and mirroring and all those things that toddlers and children desperately need to form a cohesive psychological self, he lacked. His father was also a sociopath, worked, many hours, just didn't really emotionally attuned to the kids because he didn't have the capacity to do so. So all that is sort of classic, I think, in terms of developmental trauma that results in these sorts of personality pathologies.
Harper?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's right on. I agree, Jennifer, with all of that. The coldness and the lack of warmth in the family was notable. I will add on, because of this framework that I use, I work around the emotion of shame a lot. And what we call poor shame tolerance is a core characteristic of people like Trump, who we would, again, label as sort of narcissistic, or what I use this other blamer title to identify that when they feel shame, they don't learn healthy ways to manage that, and they blame others. They engage in the list of behaviors that you read, Bill, and in that way, they become the type of person that they are. And the core of that is they don't like to be held accountable. And I saw that a lot in Mary Trump's book, where there was a lot of struggle holding Donnie accountable when he was a kid. Mom, I think, was weak and permissive or just not present. And so she didn't help him learn to tolerate those feelings of inadequacy that all kids have. And then he was also not held accountable by his father, who alternated, I think, between very authoritarian styles of parenting and then also very permissive and enabling styles of parenting. So he just didn't get a good handle on handling this feeling of inadequacy that he's now carried into adulthood. And every time he now feels inadequate, he reacts in very poor ways, lashing out at others, etc.
Bill Press with contributors to the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Carol Anderson and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.